Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Pandemonium U. My name is Pamela Druckerman. I'm coming to you live from Paris, France, where it is a sunny, balmy day. If this is your first time at Pan U, you should know that we're a free online school, in quotes, which was founded by me and my husband, Simon, at the start of the pandemic. We have about 2 classes per week, always on Monday, Wednesday, or Friday at exactly this time with experts in different fields. Either Simon and I is usually the host. We have many great classes coming up. So if you're not on our mailing list, send us an email. It's pandemoniumu2021@gmail.com, or just click through to our newsletter, which my son Leo, who is our chat master, is putting in chat right now. You can also put any questions that you have today in chat as well, and we will get to them. Today's class, I'm very happy to say, is the first in a series that we're doing about French culture, language, and history. It is co-sponsored by the Federation of Alliances Françaises USA, which promotes French language and culture through more than 100 Alliances Françaises chapters across the United States. And I'm told we have Alliances Françaises members watching today from Boston, Chicago, Cincinnati, Denver, DuPage, New Haven, North Shore, Omaha, Portland, Raleigh, Silicon Valley, and San Francisco, and from other chapters too. So welcome everyone. Hope you'll enjoy yourselves at PanU today and come back, and please do join our newsletter. A final word before we start. These classes are free. It is a family business. We are volunteers in the service of knowledge, but we have affiliated ourselves with a charity called givedirectly.org, which, as the name implies, gives money directly to people in need in poor countries. In this difficult time, we'd encourage you to donate if you can. Our guest today is Lauren Collins, who I've had the pleasure to get to know since she became the New Yorker's correspondent here in 2015. She is a tart presence on Twitter and a fierce and honest writer and observer of France, and one of the best writers I know. So welcome, Lauren. We're so glad you could be here today.
Hi, Pamela. Hello.
Hi.
I'm thrilled to be doing this. It is my first Zoominar. I was reading the paper today and I saw that the French had come up with the word WhatsAppero, which I adore. So,
leave it to them.
Well, I don't have a drink on hand and this isn't WhatsApp. I love it's fun that it's 6 o'clock for us. It's the end of a beautiful day in Paris. And I think the friendly social spirit will prevail. I also have to give a shout out to whoever's out there from Raleigh, my home state.
Yay.
Yeah.
We'll definitely talk about North Carolina. We obviously need to include that in our conversation today. But I thought we could start just by talking about what it's like being under confinement or deconfinement in Paris. First of all, is deconfinement a word in English, or is that one of those Frenchisms?
It's funny, it's one of those words that, because I've never been confined or deconfined in any place other than Paris, France, that word is definitely a part of my English or Franglish vocabulary, even if it doesn't make any sense. That same article I was reading that taught me about WhatsAppero also had a lot of great wordplay on confinement. Apparently people are just getting tired of calling it confinement because you say it all the time, right? Like confinement, deconfinement, but
it starts to lose the feeling of confinement.
That starts to lack a certain excitement. You can also call it confifi or confinage, confinette, confiturage. Like, I don't know if that's like
confiture. Like it's mixed with jam or something.
Exactly. Spread it on your toast and just eat it up. But yeah, so confinement, deconfinement, I'm going with that. I don't have a better alternative.
Apparently lots of English words are entering French at the moment. My son told me that his teacher was shouting at him, "Il faut muter, you must muter yourself," when they're doing the Zoom classes.
Il faut muter, that's a pretty good one. I also saw lundi, dimanche, like that feeling of there are no days anymore, there are no weeks, no months.
Right, it's all years. Monday is becoming
so we have that.
Sunday.
But if nothing else, it does seem like a fertile time for neologisms, corona ones. Apparently, almost all the ones in French are borrowed from other languages, though.
Right. Because they've never had a plague here or anything like that where they could have learn develop some French
I
words.
know, come on. I did not learn this in the same article I was reading, but I want to know if you know this fact. This was so exciting to me. What do you call a walkie-talkie in French?
A talkie-walkie.
A talkie-walkie.
This is my favorite French expression. I'm so glad you mentioned it.
I have to get to the bottom of it. Do you have any idea why? I didn't have time to investigate how that happened.
I think there was some mirror trick in a Radio Shack
somebody was
somewhere.
talking on a walkie-talkie or a talkie-walkie about walkie-talkies and just got it wrong and started calling it. Maybe it was kind of muffled and they just started calling it a talkie-walkie. I don't know.
Well, I mean, we've both been through this incredibly weird experience of being in lockdown in France. I have to say, I've never felt more American in France than during lockdown because you just don't hear any English anymore around you. It's all the tourists are gone, all the visitors are gone. It's just whoever happened to be here when the doors closed.
I think, exactly the opposite experience in that I don't know if I've never felt more French, but one thing I realized that I did that has never happened before, and it made me feel like maybe I belong here. I was like going straight to the French memes for coronavirus and finding them really funny. You know, the night Macron made this speech, I think it was the first televised address he gave. And one of the big kind of immortal lines from that was "L'État payera," the state will pay. I remember there was like a meme I saw and it was just like if you're shopping online and it says modes of payment, Visa, PayPal, and then it was like Macron, like "L'État payera." And I thought that was so funny. And then I was like, whoa, French memes. What's happening to me?
Well, I mean, one of the most amazing things to me in all this has been the role that Macron plays when he comes on the news. It almost feels like it's your dad coming in, you're grounded, and your dad is coming in to tell you, like, are you allowed to go outside again? Like, this week he announced.
I feel like Philippe is like, he's the bad cop. Like Macron is like the good cop, and then Philippe comes on and he's like, yeah, right. Yeah, you're never getting out of here.
But it's so much more centralized here than it would be, let's say, in America. You don't you have the president who's able to make some decisions, but you often have governors. And here it's just like the president is going to tell you if you're allowed to leave your house and when. But people have been really obedient. It's been like, I just read something today that said 98% of the people on the metro are wearing masks as they're supposed to. And
yeah, I mean, they don't have a choice, right? It is obligatory.
Right, but they're obeying, I guess.
But yeah, that's good. That's good that they're doing that. I mean, one example that actually I'm eager to kind of hear your take on is, so on the first day of deconfinement, this was the first day that people in France had been allowed out of their apartments since mid-March. And
except for the hour a day with the little permission slip.
Right. Okay. Allowed out without a permission slip and for no particular purpose. Right. And in Paris, a lot of people flocked to the banks of the Seine and to sit along the canal and like have a drink. And so that didn't fly. And, within 24 hours, it was, I mean, as you said, very centralized, fast as just. It was
literally a no drinking by the canal decree.
Yeah,
like and so the République told you, yeah.
Yeah, I guess it was I think it was the prefecture that actually issued that one. But anyway, no more drinking by the canal, which I thought was a perfectly reasonable thing to do, given that there were way too many people, congregating there. But at the same time, I kind of thought, well, you take away the banks of the Seine and you take away the canal. It's only human nature, whether, I mean, selfish and ill-advised as it is, there are going to be people who are going to go out and try to have a drink after 2 months inside. We all know that. And I thought, well, you take away all that space and you're just packing more people into even less urban space. My instinct is that like the punitive approach alone, and I said this on Twitter, but if I were an urban authority right now, which I am not, I would be trying to think of ways to give people more space rather than less. What do you think about that? Like what do you think Paris needs? How do you think Paris needs to change or not change, or just like what do you want to see happen?
Well, I think that, I mean, there was something I read today that said, it was a little announcement, instead of metro boulot dodo, which is like train work sleep, they said vélo boulot dodo, so bike work sleep. And I feel like under confinement, we all saw, and not just in Paris, but in many places, the possibilities of like a carless city and a bike friendly city. And sort of Paris became Amsterdam for a while. And we realized like so many things are so close to us. We just couldn't get there. We couldn't walk there very quickly because of all the traffic. And I feel like Paris is a very progressive city, and it was already trying to reinvent itself before the pandemic. And now I hope there's an impetus for that to happen even more. But I wanted to ask you, and people should know they can put questions and comments in chat, and my husband Simon is gonna pop in and ask them either now during our chat or at the end. But you profiled Macron, you interviewed him, you got face to face with the man himself. What were your impressions of him, and what's your sense of how, based on what you learned about him, how he's managing this crisis?
Yeah, so that was almost exactly a year ago. I mean, look, he's in a tough spot. I think one of the big mistakes that he made, just in terms of establishing sort of initial trust and credibility, is he allowed the municipal elections to go on March 15th. At the same time as shutting everything down, putting France into lockdown, probably, a week later than would have been ideal.
Right.
He said in that first televised address, there is no scientific reason why the French people, even the most vulnerable, should not go to the polls tomorrow.
Right. But that was delicate for him, because he was trying to show that he wasn't trying to use the pandemic as an excuse to become addicted.
Exactly, and he was in an impossible political position from everything I've read. I mean, I think from my reading between the lines, the subtext of all the things I've read, I can imagine a scenario in which he said, hey, this is ridiculous, let's call these off. And all of his political opponents immediately said, we're going to accuse you of stealing the election if you do that, which could have then significant consequences for the presidential election that's coming up in 2022. So I think he was in a really tough spot. In terms of the interview, I mean, I kind of, I wrote, if you want to read 8,000 words about my take on Macron's, political career, they're there. But just anecdotally, something I thought, like my takeaway.
Did you feel like you were being seduced in this famous like Macronian way, or did you feel like you were having an authentic?
It's funny. I don't think everyone uses the word seduction for him, and I don't think it's really applicable. I think it's more like his pedagogy. So, I mean, he kind of, what I thought was extraordinary, what I have never had happen in an interview with a politician, is he really answered my questions. And like, I mean, he was so on top of his like dossiers, as the French love to say. I asked him questions, I mean, yes, he is the president, but at the same time, I have been working on these questions for weeks and weeks and weeks. Very, very few dodges, very few subject changes. He knew just like incredibly kind of granular detail of a lot of things. And so I really appreciated that. I mean, even if I didn't agree, and I don't agree with his answers on some of the things, I do think that one of his gifts as a politician is a willingness to, I actually think he's at his best when he's trying to bring somebody who disagrees with him around his point of view. I think that is absolutely his strongest.
Well, he has plenty of opportunities, because like, this is a country that just loves to hate its presidents. Like, it's kind of a national sport. Like, I've always been just shocked by how like profoundly unpopular they are, even when they're doing things that seem like totally in line with the program that they ran on. I read this one stat today that said 53% of French people are angry at how Macron is handling the crisis. Like, not just, they don't just disagree, they're mad. And
I wonder
like, how do you govern?
I wonder if it was like, are you angry, aghast, furious? Or,
right, you have three choices.
But I read a similar statistic that, reported that a far greater percentage of French people were unhappy or extremely angry, choose your adjective, with Macron's handling of the crisis versus you know, his counterparts in the US and in the UK. And then I read some commentary that a lot of people saying, well, this is the French national character, you know, the French are a misanthropic kind of what people. I think some of that is also attributable to the fact that in the UK, Johnson is brand new on the job. I mean, he's not carrying as much political baggage, nearly as much political baggage as Macron is. And in the US, I mean, just apples and oranges. I'm not even going to go there, but yeah. Trump can do whatever he wants, and a certain segment of the population will vigorously support him. It's not really about what he does. It's about who he is at this point. But anyway, I just I don't think those comparisons are necessarily very valid. And I think it's also just worth pointing out that France is coming off, or probably not even coming off, but in the midst of a stretch of just insane
crises,
typical domestic. I mean, it was the terrorist attacks, it was the Gilets jaunes, it was Notre Dame, it was the pension reform and ensuing strike.
It's been a crazy news stretch in Paris.
So Macron has just, I mean, which is all to say he's already expended a lot of political capital.
Yeah. I think it's also, you know, as much as the French sort of rail against Macron, I think there's also a desire for certainty and kind of a strong hand through this crisis, which Macron is trying to offer. But we're in a situation where there is so much uncertainty, scientific, demographic, epidemiological. So it's so hard for him to, he can't kind of, and that brings up this, people are asking on chat about the schools and what France is doing about school. And there was a big announcement that school is going to reopen on the 11th of May, but then in fact, like my kids are in middle school, we have no idea when they're going back at all.
Right. That again also was kind of the good cop, bad cop dynamic, where Macron said that on television, and then the next day, Philippe, the prime minister, was like, not so fast. Then you have to add in the layer of municipal government. And I believe, anyone out there can fact check me, but I believe that the mayors have civil responsibility for the children going back to school. So
like liability, if any of the kids.
So the mayors are like, well, if any kid gets sick or hurt, or just teacher, right. There's so much uncertainty. And then I think the mayors feel like there's a lot riding on their shoulders and are like, well, if we don't have this right, you know, it's my,
and they're running for office.
It's my job, and I can't think of a not bad word to say, my bum on the line. So there's a lot of maneuvering going on there too.
Lauren, speaking of all the news that's been in Paris, I remember when I first met you, when you first moved to Paris, I remember thinking like, you're a lot like me in that you don't like, you're a journalist who doesn't love news. You know, you tend to go like around the stories and look for a new way of getting at them. Can you talk about a little bit about how you, I'm sure many people in the audience have read your amazing stories. What do you read to find your stories? How do you choose your topics? How picky are you? Do you feel like it's really obvious what to write about, or what's it like on that?
I think you remember saying to you, like, I was wary about coming to France and falling into the trap of like overgeneralizing. I think is something that I really try to think about in my coverage. I think it's easy to fall into the trap of French, therefore France. Yeah. Like, I really try to ask myself, is this a story about France, or is it just about a French person, and where do these two overlap?
Well, there is a lot of demographic data on France. It seems like there are a billion different institutes, all with different.
There is, although you know what there is a conspicuous lack of data on is race in France, and so that I'm drawn to that. I'm drawn to trying to. I'm interested in that. Like, I'm really follow everything Rakaya Diallo does, for instance, and think that there in foreign coverage of France, like there can be holes there. How do I find my stories? Reading the paper. Well, let's see.
Which papers do you read? Like, what are your
I read Le Parisien, I read Le Monde, I read Le Figaro. I don't read all of every single paper every day. I read Le JDD, I read Mediapart, I read a lot of French Twitter and go where those links take me. But
And you have the advantage, which I am very jealous of, sorry, because my husband is listening, of having, if I may say, like a French husband.
yeah, he
Who,
might be on here. I don't know. Manifest yourself.
no, but you get to feel
But-
the sort of vibrations of what's happening in France because your husband picks up on them in a way that I don't necessarily, doesn't happen in our house.
Yeah,
Unless my kids mention stuff.
well, your kids are, I mean, their antenna are good. You know, you have another generation to tap into too, which is cool.
Right.
For this, like, Jean Calment story that I did, I know you and I
Yeah.
were
This was for anyone who hasn't read it, is this like amazing story of the oldest woman in the world, supposedly, who lived in Arles in the south of France.
Yeah, that was something that I read kind of like, you know, briefly described in a French newspaper. And I just thought it sounded amazing. So yeah, that was something, or, I mean, I think I saw it in a French newspaper, but then it became like a pretty big story here, but it was just one that was so parochial in a sense until some other things happened that it hadn't been covered that much abroad. And I thought, this is just like a great yarn. So
basically, can you tell us briefly what the story was, like in a capsule?
Okay, yeah. So Jeanne Calment was a woman who either did or did not live until the age of 122 years old, making her the oldest person who ever did or did not live. But she had set this record, I think it was either 1995 or 1996 when she died. And it is a striking record because nobody has come anywhere close to her. I think the other oldest people are either 118 or 119, but in gerontological years, that's like a century. I mean, it's like,
because every extra year requires like some incredible feat of
right, so much. And so the theory was that as the world's population grew, logically the proportion of people living to these ages would also grow. But that this many years have gone by and nobody has come within striking distance at all of Jeanne Calment. So some people, you know, people had always been a little bit like, it's really weird how old she is, but nobody thought much of it, I think. And then last year, some kind of amateur researchers in Russia came up with this wild hypothesis that it wasn't Jeanne Calment who died at 122. In fact, she had died in 1934. The family had done a body switch.
For insurance reasons, which of course in France is always.
According to the official story, her daughter died of tuberculosis in 1930.
Right. So she swapped, basically, the idea was her daughter took her place, and the person who died at 122 was actually her daughter, who was only 100 or something.
Yeah, it was like also quite, yeah.
There was quite a bit of longevity in this family, but it wasn't right. So you did, the reason why the story was so amazing is you did this, not only you told this story, you found it, you told this story, but you also did this investigation yourself about whether it really was her or was her daughter. And
I got so into it. I was like, oh, I'm going to do this story about this, you know, super, what is it called? Super
Genarian.
Not super centenarian. Gonna go hang out in Arles, you know, maybe see some photography, like drink some rosé. No, but I thought it was gonna be just kind of like a fun, larky story. And then, I mean, it ate up. How
many months did you spend on the story? Let me get jealous here.
No, I spent 6 months on this story, but I really had to like just pull the ripcord at some point. And it was so
better done than perfect is what I tell myself when I'm ready.
Arles has some of the most, some of the best preserved and just most voluminous and fabulous archives of anywhere in the world, first of all. Jeanne Calment had lived there her whole life with the same name because she married a cousin and then had the same name all along. She had only lived at 3 addresses in her life. I mean, it was like a journalist.
So was it, are you going to tell us, was it her or was it her daughter?
I think after careful research and perusal of the archives, I think that she actually lived to 122 years old. There is
amazing
lots of persuasive evidence for that. That said, I cannot say for sure. And I mean, the thing that was really interesting is the Russians were using kind of a lot of these tactics that we've seen I don't know in everything now, but conspiracies. And I mean, if you say that something isn't something, there's really no way to prove.
Right, you can't prove a negative.
Yeah,
hey,
I mean,
Lauren, we're getting lots of questions about French and English
okay.
and your use of both.
Yes.
People want to know, you wrote a book when in French about learning French, falling in, if I may say, falling in love in French? Or can you fall in love in the same way in a foreign language? You married someone who's a foreigner who speaks excellent English, and yet will you ever really communicate? You know, I can tell you as someone who's married to a native speaker, it's not always the easiest thing in the world, of course. So do you write in French or in English? People are asking, could you write in French as well as in English? And is your French at the level where you can be funny in French? Can you feel like yourself in French?
Okay, let's see. I'll try to go backwards.
Okay.
Can I be funny in French? I know that I made a joke in French the other day. I can't remember what it was. Yes, I am hilarious in French. So much funnier than I am in English. You should meet me in French. You would
and your German self is just like crazy hilarious. Right?
Can I write as well in French as I can in English? No, nowhere near. I did do a column, a very, very short column for French Marie Claire for like a year. It was really short. I mean, when I say a column, like it was 2 or 3 paragraphs, but I loved doing it. It had to be heavily edited, and you know, I'm sure my editor did not love doing it, but
I feel like I suffer in French in a way that you don't. I really, walk around, and in France, I walk around going, am I ever going to fit in here? Am I ever going to speak decent French? It's like I'm the ancient mariner of French, and you're just like, I'm here. I write a column in French. I'm fine.
You need to brush up on the memes, Pamela. That's all it takes to feel truly assimilated. An account, my go-to meme account on Instagram is Mamouz, M-A-M-O-U-Z. I'm not sure what her actual name is because that's like the handle that comes up. But that's where I've been getting all my dank French memes.
Do you read books in French?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it takes me a lot longer than it does in English, obviously. But that's something I really enjoy. I mean, I think that's one of the big payoffs of all the work that you do put in to try to learn a language. Is like
you get the books.
Yeah.
And you basically brought, I mean, speaking of books, you basically brought Leila Slimani, who's now like a best-selling American writer, to the American audience. I mean, how did you come upon her book?
I'm sure she would have made her way there anyway, but I bought her book. Actually, I know why I bought it. I bought it because it was based on this really just haunting story about a nanny on the Upper West Side of New York who had killed 2 of the children in her care. And I lived in New York during the time that it happened. It had totally, marked me, as they say in French. And I mean, I had just followed it like really assiduously at the time. So then when I read that there was somebody had written a novel that had kind of used that partially as inspiration, I was like, well, I just really want to read this. And so I picked it up, I read it, and I just thought it was so, I mean, I just thought it was.
Isn't that just the best experience to discover a book that you can, then
I mean, to be fair, I think it was already like, I'm sure it was like a bestseller in France already, but for me, it was a big discovery. And I just thought, I thought people should know about this writer.
There's also something.
She just won the Goncourt. I mean, yeah, there.
Yeah, okay. Like if she wasn't a random book in a
right. But it was exciting to me that she hadn't been translated in English yet, and I was just like, oh, I can't wait. And actually, that's something I have a friend who is a French reader and French speaker. Her mother was Belgian, and she's an editor at a publishing house in New York. And this is something I just really like to do as my like self-appointed side hustle now is like, I'm like, you should publish this in English, publish this in English, publish this in English. If I ever have a second career, yeah.
I love that. I think there's something about, and we'll get to some questions in a sec, but there's something about Leila Slimani. What is the name of her book in English? It's Chanson Douce in
It's The Perfect Nanny in English, which I really, really hated as the
that's a little
title.
Yeah. But there's something about her fierceness and her darkness that seemed to kind of, first of all, destroy the sort of French women stereotypes that we all talk. I mean, I guess there was a bit of overlap, But it also seemed like a book for the Me Too moment too. It's had sort of perfect alchemy to land at that moment and be that
Wait,
book.
I don't know if I follow you there. Why do you think it was the perfect book for the Me Too moment?
Because it's a moment when female anger was coming to the surface, and female lust, and sort of women taking control of the sexual conversation.
Oh God, if you want to read about female lust, read her first novel.
Yes, you know what? I think I'm confusing it with the first one.
It's in English. It's Le Jardin, dans le Jardin de l'Ogre, I think, in French. That is lusty.
How do you, as like a woman who's in Paris writing about France, like how do you grapple with the whole like meme of the French woman and this kind of stereotype?
I'm really, I try to avoid the stereotype of the French woman. I mean, I try to really like think about what I'm writing. This woman named Alice Pfeiffer wrote a book called Je ne suis pas parisienne, I'm not Parisian, which really made a big impression on me. And I think it's such a brilliant book because she kind of deconstructs the stereotype of the, you know, straight, white, upper class woman from Paris being mistaken for the French woman, the average French woman. I mean, and it's like, you know, if you were to like walk around the Upper East Side or Park Slope or something and somehow purport that the women that you see represented America, which they don't at all. But Alice's book is so brilliant because like, she's like, okay, the French woman, she rides a bicycle. What does that tell us? That she doesn't rely on public transportation. She wears a boyfriend button down. What does that tell us? That she's straight. She has a bedhead. What does that tell us? That she has a certain hair texture, you know, often belonging to a white woman. I thought the book was really, really brilliant. And Alice also goes through all these other stereotypes, the not Parisians that are used to define the Parisians. So like La Cagoule, this kind of body woman from the South, and how different, you know, domestic stereotypes also are used as foils to the Parisian. Anyway, I love this book. I totally commend it to anyone, but it hasn't been published in English yet, I don't think, but I think it will be, last time I checked.
But at the same time, I think there are genuine, I mean, obviously there are stereotypes that we can fall into, but there are genuine cultural differences between America and France. They're not true.
But you did this so well in your book, Pamela, in not your most recent book, but what is the American title? Is it French Kids Don't Throw Food, or is it Bringing Up Bébé in America? But actually we probably have people from the UK listening too. Anyway, what you do so well though is like, there absolutely are cultural differences, but I think what you do well and what I really try to do is to back that up with something, whether it be statistics, whether it be, I mean, something that's great also is we were talking about like the country is so centralized. Like when you were saying, okay, French kids will eat X, Y, or Z. It's not because you saw your neighbor's kids eating X, Y, or Z. It's because you're looking at the menus that are in the creche and that are in the schools every week. I mean, I think when there's, particularly when you know that it's a national phenomenon, it's like much more valid to call something French.
I also feel like I'm always out there on the ledge, like if I'm making any kind of claim about France, and I want to have as much as possible underneath me to solidify my claim.
Exactly.
But I think one of the delights of living here, and one of the things I like the best about being a journalist here, is like everything seems very similar, and then you're at a dinner party or you're in a conversation and someone says something completely wacky and you're like, what did they just, and you see that like there's a different way of seeing the world, and it makes every part of daily life, from like going to the dry cleaner to dealing with school to going to the pediatrician, just that much less boring than it would be otherwise.
There's just so much, I mean, every single day something happens to me that I'm like, what was that? Or that was cool. Or I think you're so right. I mean, I think a lot of the things that maybe if I weren't a writer would just be like rank frustration are just kind of like really interesting when you're, you know, approaching life with kind of a notebook, like if not in hand, at least in mind, you know?
Do you feel like your friends are afraid of you now because every time they say anything remotely interesting, you just scribble it down in a notebook? I feel like I've lost a lot of people.
I'm afraid you might be, no, but no, I'm pretty careful about, I always ask.
Uh-huh. I asked too, but like probably too far down the road for them to say no. I don't want to lose good material. My husband has told me I'm not allowed to keep a notebook on the table at dinner parties anymore.
What questions did I not answer?
We're getting lots of wonderful comments from Lauren Elkin, who is another author who we will hopefully have on this program, who's saying that the name of Leila Slimani's first book is Adele. Simon, are there any questions that you want to point to?
Yeah, I wanted to put one to you.
Go ahead, Simon, go for it.
Okay, Christine Rapinac asks, there seem to have been fewer protests in France than in the US against confinement, even though France obviously has a protest culture. Why might this be?
Well, we can conjecture that people were not against confinement. I mean, I think like, no, I haven't, I mean, you know, the death toll was just rising and terrifying, and you know, maybe people A, didn't want to die. Maybe B, we could also think about the fact that, you know, maybe people were protested out. Maybe people didn't want to pay the €135 fine, which is pretty steep, and I think was being, you know, pretty strongly, if selectively, enforced all over. What do you think? What do you guys think? I'm interested.
Simon, I'd be interested in what you think. I think part of it was a lot of the deaths were happening in these old age homes, which have the weirdest acronym I've ever heard. So if somebody could put it in the chat what EHPAD actually stands for, it's crazy. But it was just really shocking to see the number of deaths that were happening in old age homes, and even an older population, a lot of, even in Paris, a lot of older people who live alone, and I think that part of it was really terrifying.
Can I interject? Like, as much as France has a protest culture, it also has a solidarity culture.
Yeah.
And, you know, so maybe the same kind of community organizing and the same kind of, you know, that feeling.
And memories of the war are still alive in France. And
maybe that feeling keeps people in their apartments as much as it can get people out in the streets.
Yeah, and you didn't have a group of people in the politics like in the US saying this is an assault on individual freedom and we must take the state houses. The other thing is that protests in France are usually organized by trade unions over labor issues, and this doesn't seem to have hit that particular nerve.
Well, and you also don't have any kind of dark money seeding these protests either. I mean, you don't, so that's something to keep in mind too.
But I think it's one of the concerns moving forward in France is like, what's going to happen next? You're already seeing discontent over the fact that people in poor neighborhoods and disadvantaged people were, like everywhere else, disproportionately affected, are being disproportionately affected by COVID, locked in, you know, houses that were under much worse conditions. And there is such a cleavage already in France. You saw that in the last presidential election, and you saw that with the Yellow Vest movement. What's, you know, could we be leading toward more division? And it's something we've talked about on Pandemonium U a lot, or not. You know, what are the risks here?
There's another question from Anne Pedersen, referring, I think, to Lauren's wonderful article about Notre Dame last year. How is the reconstruction of Notre Dame going?
Ooh, does anybody know? I know it's on hold right now, or it was during confinement. Macron promised to have it, or I don't know if he promised, but he said that they would try to have it done within 5 years, which was already just a wildly ambitious target. I don't think there's any way that's going to happen. I mean,
we are working on getting someone to come on Pandemonium U and give a talk about exactly the rebuilding of Notre Dame. So I think that's a question we can answer at great length and detail in the future. Simon, were there other questions that we wanted to get to?
Yeah, Barry notes that a lot of Parisians have been going to Brittany. He has family in the westernmost part of Brittany. In the west and southwest of France, there isn't really a pandemic. People are worried about Parisians coming and spreading COVID to them. How much of a political or social tension is this creating, do we think?
Barry is a she, Simon.
Oh, I apologize.
sorry, because I interrupted you. Brittany, and how much do we worry about political? Can you just read the last part again?
So Parisians have 10% of the city has fled to country homes, often in the west and southwest of France, where there isn't really a pandemic. There's almost no COVID there. Worry there that Parisians are spreading the infection to them. And as France opens up, I guess that will become more of a worry. How much of a issue of social tension do you see that as being?
Well, apparently, I'll just say really quickly that Brittany didn't want Parisians to come at the beginning of the pandemic, but now that the summer is starting and so much of their economy depends on tourists coming for the summer, they're trying to open the beaches and get people to arrive. So it's
yeah, I mean, so right now we're legally bound to stay within 100 kilometers of our homes. That said, the Prime Minister did say yesterday that French people will be able, coronavirus willing, should book vacations. I mean, this has also been like a real topic here. First of all, because vacation matters here. But second of all, because it's such a huge driver of the economy. So there's been a lot of talk about how to save the season. And the Prime Minister told French people to go ahead and book vacations for July and August, that they will be allowed to go on vacation in France. So I think they were talking about a Marshall Plan for tourism was what he called it. And obviously with the rules that they've decided to enforce, are making French people vacation in France this summer, which obviously has an economic dimension to it. So that's all to say that while I think there was like a lot of tension, I mean, Pamela, I think you're right, just that there's a chronological dimension to it. Yeah. And now the idea is like, let's get French people, spending their money in France this summer is kind of where the conversation is right now.
Lauren, I know, just to switch this to a more personal level, but this is something you've written about recently for the New Yorker. You haven't been able to go home, obviously, back to North Carolina. And sadly, you lost your father, not to the coronavirus, but to cancer during the confinement. Can you talk a little bit about what that's been like, and also to pivot to a happier note afterward, about your new project, your new book project that you're working on that's set in North Carolina?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's any expatriate or immigrant. I prefer to call myself an immigrant, but just, so no one's confused as to why I say that. It's everyone's worst nightmare. I mean, anyone who lives far, far away from their family, it's your worst nightmare that something would happen to someone and you would not be able to go there for one reason or another. And, for some people that is because they don't have the right passport. For some people, it's because they don't have the money. For me, it was because my father's decline, very fast decline in death happened in the middle of a global pandemic. So it was nightmare. At the same time, and I wrote about this in this essay in the New Yorker, I think what I wrote, and I stand by this, is that it was also a good lesson in proportion, to lose someone you love in the midst of a global pandemic that's already taken hundreds of thousands of lives. I'm not the only person going through something like this right now. And since writing the piece, I've had so many letters from people who said, the same thing happened to me. The exact same thing happened to me. And so, I don't know how to wrap that all up neatly. It's obviously like it's a messy.
Why did you decide to write about it? Or how did you come to the decision to write about it?
So, I didn't even decide to write about it so much as I was just, first of all, this has never happened to me. Like, I don't keep a diary. I don't really write for fun or as emotional catharsis just for me. But really, the day after my father died, I pulled out my chair and sat down at my desk and was just like, I have to write this. But I knew I wanted to write it. I didn't know if I wanted to publish it. And I'm really glad I did, just because of the sort of community and solidarity I felt from this conversation amongst all these people who are going through grief right now. So it was a good thing for me, and I hope that, and I know actually from the things that people have written to me that it was a good thing for other people too.
It was a really beautiful piece, and your father sounds like he was an amazing man. So your new book is set. It's interesting to me that you're living in France and you've chosen a topic for a new book that's back in North Carolina.
And just to say what it is, I'm writing about a white supremacist massacre and coup that happened in my hometown in 1898. And the story begins there, but what I'm trying to do is then to trace its effects through the destinies of several families over the past 120 years into the present day.
Great. Well, I'm sure as soon as you can get back to North Carolina for all kinds of reasons, you will be on the first plane, as many of us will be. Yeah. Well, I think we're going to have to end it there. Thank you, Lauren, so much for taking the time to talk to us today. It was such a pleasure.
And thank you so much, everybody who tuned in for this or whatever you say, but it was fun. I'm so glad you asked me to do it.
We have wonderful questions that we couldn't get to on chat. A lot of praise for Lauren, rightfully, and for her wonderful pieces, including her recent piece on her father. I urge everyone to go on newyorker.com and read Lauren's pieces to deepen your understanding of France. Thank you again to our co-sponsor for this event today, the Federation of Alliances Françaises USA, which promotes French culture and language all across the United States. We're grateful to them and for the work they do. This is the first in a series of talks that we're going to do with them about France. We have this time next week, Jessica Green, who's a wine expert, taking us on a tour of the wines of France. We're gonna publish some wines that you can have at home just from different regions, not specific wines, but different grapes that you can buy and regional wines. So you can taste along with us or just watch the talk and learn, like I would like to, finally what the difference is between these regions, why they're different, what they taste like, how I can order the wine that I want, because I never seem to express myself well enough. If you're not on our mailing list, in chat, please click through and join our mailing list. We have many, many more classes coming up on all kinds of topics, including next week. And if you can't click through, just send us an email. It's pandemoniumu2021@gmail.com. Did I say everything, Simon?
There's one more.
Yeah.
Just on the Alliance Française subject, if you're in the US and you want to improve your French or find French themes events, then go to afusa.org, and find the Alliance Française chapter near you. Native fluent teachers, small classes, online or in a classroom, and you can speak French like Lauren too.
Can I say one more thing too? I just forgot. I wanted to say that in my confinement time, I started a newsletter about, it's kind of a place for like the stuff that doesn't make it into my correspondence about France. It's called Lettres Recommandées, and I'm like, I don't know where you can sign up for it. There is a link to it in my Twitter bio, and I'll put it on Instagram too. But anyway, just because I know there are.
No, it's a fantastic, I've only read the first one, but it's a fantastic kind of granular look at what life in France is really like in all its details, with lots of links and funny words.
Since we have the Francophile crowd out there. Anyway, this has been so much fun. Thank you guys. Thank you, Leo, too.
Well, thank you everyone for being at Pandemonium U. We have a tradition that at the end of our classes, we unmute everyone and we give our